How's everyone doing today?
Good.
Okay. This here's Derek.
It's kind of strong.
He's a former farmer just like me. And there's something amazing about people who know the land and then transfer that into knowing how to be a shepherd of a different kind of a flock. And I think there's a rootedness there, and I'm talking about him, but there's a rootedness there to what's important in life, and it keeps us grounded when all the bells and the whistles and the things that look glittery are torn away. There's a rootedness to what God has given, what God has created, that gives us purpose and strength. And so, Jesus, would you be with Derek as he shares?
Yes.
As we look at how can we be a part of discipling the next generation. I ask in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Derek. So, like Derek mentioned, my name is Derek. I'm a pastor here at WB Church. I pastor our families, and I also pastor our hospitality teams, and a little bit of everything else. So, I'm just a pastor here, doing a bit of everything. Like Derek said, I was raised on a farm, a dairy farm, and he said, if you can be a farmer, you can maybe do ministry. I haven't decided yet what's more frustrating, the cows or people. Jury's still on that, but yeah, I was raised on a farm and still help my dad out quite often. I am engaged to my fiancée Abigail. We're getting married May 11th, which is coming up really soon, in just a few months. It's coming up quick. Lots to do yet. And I studied, I'm going to put the mic here. I studied at Briarcrest College in Saskatchewan. Who here has been to Saskatchewan before?
Yeah.
Awesome. Has anyone been to Briarcrest College before in Saskatchewan? We got a couple? Okay, awesome. Yeah, I studied at Briarcrest in Saskatchewan, which is in the little town. I'm going to pull this up because I'm tall. Which is in the little town of Cairnport, Saskatchewan. It's a little village with a college. It was a Bible college, and then about 10 to 15 years ago it became a Christian liberal arts college, similar to Redeemer, Tyndale, or Trinity Western. And I did lots of interesting things in my studies. Specifically, I did a lot of studies on both pastoral ministry, but also adolescent studies, which comes in handy for what I'm doing in this role as well. A few interests I have, and topics that I enjoy include individualism and consumerism, which we'll talk about a bit today, and how that's affected the church. Also, I really enjoy looking at church trends, where we're going, and where we've been in history. I'm a big history guy. If I didn't do pastoral ministry, I probably would have done history. Became a high school history teacher, because I really enjoy that aspect as well. Now today we're looking at a few different things. We're going to be looking at discipleship of the next generation, but first we're going to look at what is Generation Z, or Z. What is Generation Z? And then we're going to look at the spiritual generation. We're going to be looking at the rise of spiritualism, which is fascinating, and some brand new research there. And then we're going to look at the hope we have for today and tomorrow. So first, this is a list of generations. Now, there is not agreement among the years. So, to be fair, there's disagreement among the years, but this is our list of generations. Right now, the kids being born right now are Generation Alpha, or Gen Alpha. We're going to be talking a bit about Gen Alpha today, but a lot more about Generation Z. So as you can see, Generation Z are kids about 25 and that, 25 to like age 11. So kind of our teenagers and young adults of today. And then we're also going to be talking about how millennials, Gen X's, and the different generations affect it as well. I thought it'd be fun here to identify who's in what generation. We'll go by this list. So, raise your hand if you're in Gen Alpha. No one? Okay, that's interesting. Raise your hand if you're in Generation Z. I'm on the cusp. I'm like the cusp of the millennial and Gen Z. Millennials? Still millennials? Okay. Gen Xers. Hey. Millennial. One millennial. Very good. Millennial. Gen Xers. Any Gen Xers? No Gen Xers? Okay, I feel like we might get a few more hands on these next three. The baby boomers. Where's the boomers at? Okay. Awesome. They call it boomers for a reason. There's a lot of you. All right, the next, the silent generation. Okay, we have a lot of silent generation.
Yeah, we're quiet.
I didn't come up with the names. And the next is the greatest generation. Okay, no greatest generation. That would mean you'd be almost 100, so that'd be impressive. All right, so before we begin, you can discuss at your tables what is the primary ways you currently interact with younger generation. So we'll talk about like Generation Z and Alpha, so 25 and under. And if you don't have grandkids, what are the ways you interact? Maybe it's going to the grocery store, maybe it's at the coffee shop, maybe it's at church. What are some ways that you interact with the younger generation? And if you could describe those generations in 1 to 3 words, or if you really need a sentence, I'll give you a sentence. If you could describe those generations in 1 to 3 words, how would you describe them? You can discuss. Okay, let's come back, everyone. So, I'm gonna pull mics. So first, let's look at what is Generation Z. I'm curious though, before we look at this, what were some of the words you came up with to describe them? What were some of the words you came up with, Fred?
One word.
Sorry?
One word.
One word, what was that?
Confused.
Confused, yeah. Yeah. What are some other words or short phrases?
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Not confused.
Not confused.
Optimistic.
As being part of Gen Z, I'd say we're a little confused at the very least. Optimistic.
Optimistic.
Yeah.
Busy and active.
Busy. Yeah. Busy is a big one. Yeah.
Helpful.
Helpful. Yeah.
Very tech savvy.
Tech savvy. Yeah. Yeah.
What was that?
Yeah, they can help. Garrett's pretty tech savvy as well, so that's not cut and dry. Yeah. Tech obsessed. Yeah, no, for sure.
Don't do that.
The statistics say that. Yeah. I thought it was that. Yeah, it's just her waving. Yeah. No, those are great. Those are great. Just a little bit. You know what? There's a lot of ups and there's a lot of downs, and a lot of in between. Here is Gen Z. These are just some aspects of Gen Z. Number one, they're the most ethically diverse generation. Now, part of that's due to our immigration numbers and other reasons, but they are the most ethically diverse generation in Canada's history. And that's the world in which they're being raised. They're more justice conscious. Now, I use justice in quotation marks because sometimes there's a confused definition of justice, but they have good intentions. Overall, very wanting to pursue justice. We see that in terms of race. We see that in terms of different world events. On track to become the most educated generation in Canada. So we're seeing education numbers rise as well. They're also the generation raised with cell phone technology, social media. So this is some of the social media aspects that we were mentioning. 71% spend 3 or more hours per day on screen time. That is a long time. And that is 71%. That's over half. 97 of all Generation Z's individuals learn about new products from social media. The number one way that they are marketed to is through their social streams, right? So social media is having a huge impact on Generation Z. There's a guy by the name of Andrew Zersky, not that you would know that name. He wrote a book about how their Generation Z is finding their koinonia, or their fellowship, through technology and cell phones. Now, whether or not that is a good way of doing so, it's the main way that they're searching for that fellowship.
It's not real fellowship.
Now, they also faced the pandemic in their formative years, right? So if you think about how that affected them in different ways, some people, they're pulled out of school, they're now in online classes, some missed graduations, some missed big life events like prom, and sports is a big one, missed formable things in those pandemic years. Now, one thing we're noticing with Gen Z is they're forming their adult identities 5 to 7 years later than previous generations.
Wow.
5 to 7 years, so 5 to 7 years later. Now, I mean, I would agree with that. I would see that, right? We're seeing kids get jobs later. We're seeing kids start their careers later. We're seeing kids move out of home later. Now, part of that is not of their fault. The housing market right now is crazy. I just was looking for a rental. The cheapest we could find was $2,000 a month. It's hard for kids to move out of the house at those prices, right? So that's definitely an aspect of that for sure. Gen Zs have only an 8-second attention span, down 4 seconds from millennials. 8 seconds. That's what technology will do to you. About 3 in 10 live in a household with an unmarried parent. That's a big aspect too. We're seeing the breakdown of the family structure, and we are now seeing 3 in 10, almost a third, living in a household with an unmarried parent. Now this one's interesting, but I think it actually points to something noticeable, is we're seeing an uptick. In the last 6 years, homeschooling has doubled. Homeschooling has doubled, which is interesting. It's a different way that parents are approaching trying to parent their kids, and they're seeing different trends and they're pulling them out in homeschooling. Now, Generation Z is now becoming the parents too, and we're seeing that uptick in homeschooling, which is really fascinating. I think there's a few reasons for that. Now, that's just a little bit of what is Generation Z and some of the different things that are affecting them. A lot of great things with Generation Z, like we saw. They're pursuing justice, the new innovations, but then there's also a lot of hurt that can come with Gen Z. Now here's where we're really going to touch down for a good chunk of our time together. And that is Gen Z and the church, or I would call the spiritual generation. Now, Gen Z is a generation that was raised primarily in a de-churched population. Who here's heard the word de-churched before? De-churched. Can anyone describe what is de-churched? What is de-churched? What does that mean?
Getting out.
Yeah. It's actually, it's kind of in the word, right? De-churched is people that used to be in church and now have left the church. Right? So they are de-churched. Now, this is really interesting. I'm going to go right down to the last point there. 98% of de-churched evangelicals believe that Jesus is Son of God. The majority of de-churched evangelicals still hold to orthodoxy. They still hold to the core beliefs of the Christian faith. Many actually identify as having a personal relationship with Jesus, and yet they're not attending church. And we are seeing different church rejections. We're seeing churches shrink. They're now down to 60 people. In America, 40 million adults used to go to church but no longer do. 40 million. 40 million adults. That's 16% of the population. Now, when we really saw de-churching ramp up was in the 1990s. Ryan Burge, who does statistics, he said in the early 1990s, an inflection point for American religion. Between the early 1970s and 1990s, the share of Americans who had no religious affiliation had only risen 2 points. But from that point forward, the nuns would grow by a percentage point or 2 nearly every year for the following 3 decades. So, we are seeing Gen Zs and Generation Alpha being pulled out of the church in their formative years.
Can you describe what nuns mean?
Yes. So nuns would be those who would have no religious affiliation. Yeah, so 0 religious affiliation. So, what does this mean? We're seeing these Generation Zs and Gen Alphas in their formative years being pulled out of church. That's less kids in kids ministry, youth ministry. And they're also hearing a ton of church hurt from their parents. Statistically, they're hearing a ton of church hurt from their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and friends. And now many are hearing church hurt from each other, right? So the messages that they're hearing about church and the institutionalized church are primarily negative, which is a shift. Because in the past, many generations overall were hearing messages that were primarily positive about church, right? If you think back to your childhood, some of you definitely maybe had church hurt, but the overall messages of church were primarily positive. And now that's shifting. If they weren't de-churched themselves, many had a de-churched friend. Many were seeing their friends drop out of church throughout. So they're being raised in that population. Now there's two big studies. I'm going to point to a third. All you guys recommended resources. Okay, this book right here, The Great Dechurching, it was just released and has all the new statistics that are saying about the de-church, and it says why they're leaving, where they're going, and what will take to bring them back. It's a really good book. Number one thing that we find will bring them back, they say they get a personal invite. Number one reason people say they'll go back. Two other big studies that I use for my research is the Hemorrhaging Faith, and the reason I use these two studies is they're Canadian. So they were done by the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Number one is Hemorrhaging Faith, why and when Canadian young adults are leaving, staying, and returning to church. A couple of key aspects we're seeing in this study. We're seeing, yes, a lot of young adults are leaving during their university years, which sometimes it means just simply moving away from home. They're not going with their family anymore, they own it themselves. That's been going on for years. One thing that's really interesting, kids who went to do Christian education had way higher statistical probability of staying in church. So Christian education was a key reason for staying in church. Actually, sorry, that was a renegotiating the faith. I mixed up my studies. Hemorrhaging the Faith was an earlier study. So Hemorrhaging the Faith was around 10 years ago, and they said 2/3 of young people are going to leave the church. 2/3 of young people. They said 1/3 will return, and 1/3 will never return. That study was from 2012. The Renegotiating Faith was a 2019 study that looked at more like why they're leaving and those new trends. And they found some things that keep them in: solid community, Christian camps, Christian colleges. But still, we're seeing a lot drop out. And those were two Canadian studies. So I use those studies a lot, so that's why I just referenced them. So, 3 things we're going to look at in terms of the church. Number one, I call the 1990s youth ministry effect. The cruise ship effect. We're talking about cruise ships. And then the rise of spiritualism. The reason we're going through it this way is this is my hope. We see a situation today, we're actually going to be talking about, really exciting, I'm really excited about it, some brand new studies that came out in December and January on the rise of spiritualism. It's blowing my mind, maybe it'll blow yours. But I think first we need to look back and be like, why are we here? So that's our hope, that's where we're going. Number one was what I call the 1990s youth ministry effect. Who here, and I don't expect many people to necessarily know this, has anyone here heard of youth specialties before? Okay, we have a couple. Youth Specialties was the organization that essentially drove the way we do youth group today. Who here would say they've seen a difference in how the church interacts with the young people and youth compared to when they were children? Right? So the modern youth group, what are some aspects of the modern youth group? Games, yeah. Food. That's actually newer, but yeah, food. Music. Maybe a message. Maybe some small group discussion. Now, what in the modern youth group, although state better, we'll talk about that. Let's say for sure the 1990s, early 2000s youth group, the average youth group, if they looked at how much time they allotted to each one, guess which one was number one?
Fun.
Fun and games, right? I actually talked to one youth pastor. They did games for an hour and a half, a 15-minute talk, and maybe 10 minutes of discussion. The ratios are big. Fun and games is number one. The reason that we do youth groups the way we do is thanks primarily to an organization called Youth Specialties. In 1970s, there was a guy named Chris Rice and Mike Akinelli. They formed Youth Specialties. And they came out with this book called Ideas. And it was a book of ideas for ways to attract young people to faith and ways to attract young people to want to go to church. And they sold 1 million of them. They were selling out like crazy. And all of a sudden we saw this change in youth ministry from a primarily Bible study, Sunday school feel to this more game-centered attractional model. Now the idea was bring them in with the fun, and hit them with Jesus. That was kind of the idea. I actually talked to a youth pastor once. He ran a paintball ministry out of his youth group. And his idea was literally this: bring them here for 2 hours of paintball, and then we're going to do a 10-minute talk. Give them the gospel message at the end, right? 2 hours of paintball, 10-minute talk. Those people just played paintball for 2 hours. They are exhausted, their mind's elsewhere. We're going to give them a 10-minute talk. One of the main reasons that we actually also saw this, it was 2 reasons. It was youth specialties, and also the influence of Youth for Christ, and also Young Life. They believed in bringing in fiery speakers with lots of fun to get the kids to want to participate. So we saw even Billy Graham had to start in Youth for Christ. And he was this fiery preacher that the kids would want to listen to. We're going to get them in, and Youth for Christ events would have beach balls everywhere, and it would be this big spectacle. Get them in with the fun, hit them with the gospel. Mike Yaconelli, who was one of the founders of Youth Specialties, he kind of invented this idea. He was taken from us in 2003, died of a car crash. A couple months before he died, he wrote this, and this is the paper you have in front of you. He wrote this a couple months before he died. Attend, he entitled it The Failure of Youth Ministry. Attend any youth group in this country and notice the aging effect. Attendance is directly proportional to age. The older the students, the fewer are likely to attend youth group. Typically, there are more freshmen than sophomores, more sophomores than juniors, and more juniors than seniors. I'm sure there are many reasons for this phenomenon. Older students are more likely to work, more likely to have a car, more likely to be extremely busy. But the real reason is that older students are much more likely to lose interest in Christianity, lose the desire to stay close to Christ, or don't lose the willingness to pay the price of the commitment. In the everyday battle for the souls of the older students, the lure of the secular is just too strong. Almost every study, this is 2003, remember this is 2003, 20 years ago. Almost every study out there shows that when it comes to moral behavior, there's no difference between secular and Christian students. They drink as much, screw as much, have oral sex as much, and party as much. Why? Youth ministry doesn't have any staying power. Young people flock to Christian concerts, cheer Jesus at large events, and work on service projects. Unfortunately, it's not because of Jesus. It's because they're young. The success of youth ministry in this culture is an illusion. Remember, he's writing this in 2003, which I would actually call one of the high points of youth ministry in America in terms of numbers. He's writing this right when they're at one of their high points in how many kids are going to youth ministry. He says, very little youth ministry has a lasting impact on students. I believe we are no more effective today at reaching young people with the gospel than we've ever been. In spite of all the dazzling superstars of youth ministry, the amazing array of youth specialties products, the thousands of youth ministry training events, nothing much has changed. Following Jesus is hard. Faith is difficult. Discipleship requires a huge investment of time. Most of us don't have that time, or we choose not to make the time. This is key. Our current models of ministry don't allow us to have the time. So let's be honest. Youth ministry as an experiment has failed. If we want to see the church survive, we need to rethink youth ministry. What does that mean? I don't have a clue. But my hunch is that if we want to see young people have a faith that lasts, then we need to completely change the way we view youth ministry in America. I wonder, if any of us have the courage to try. Yaconelli, like I said, he passed away 2 months later of a car crash he was taken from us. He was ahead of his time. I truly believe he was a prophet ahead of his time there, speaking of what was to come. He says, look, I invented youth ministry. He literally did. He literally invented how we do modern youth ministry. And he's like, I've seen it now for about 30 years, and it has failed. It has failed. We do not have the longevity. Kids are showing up for the fun, but we do not have the longevity. We're going to go to some more table discussion on this. What are your thoughts on Yaconelli's observations? And what are some ways you think the church can create lasting discipleship for young people? Discuss. More on Yaconelli's thoughts. He didn't write this book in the sense he didn't put it together. He passed away, his kids put this book together after he passed. But these are just different essays and journals they found after he passed, and he's just writing. And he actually doesn't come up with a lot of solutions in the sense, because he's like, I don't know what to do. He takes the blame for a lot. He's like, I created this mess and now I don't know what to do. But his thoughts are fascinating in that. You know, I've done youth ministry for a number of years. I've lived in this model. I was raised in this model. I've seen how unsuccessful this model of youth ministry was. I mean, if I look back, my youth group had around 60 to 80 kids, 20 to 25 or so Christians today, right? The stats, even for my own youth group, aren't great. So the model is what I would call a failed experiment like Yaconelli. So what's next? And what does this lead to? This is one other point I had. Younger generations are looking for something genuine. You know, that's something we're talking about at the end. What are young people actually looking for? They're looking for something genuine. But first, the cruise ship model, or the cruise ship effect rather. We raise the kids in this youth ministry, and then we're led to these kids being raised in that, and the effects of that. And one of the biggest effects is what I would call the cruise ship effect, although as you'll see, I didn't come up with that term. So we have a video, and then we're going to discuss.
According to the Bar Organization, 1 in 3 Americans are now officially de-churched. That's a lot of people, and you might be one of them. Many people, especially church leaders, are trying to understand why church engagement is declining. And it's easy to blame those who are leaving. People are too self-centered today, or youth sports are taking over Sunday mornings. Christian faith is under attack in the culture. Listen, I'll be the first to admit that there are all kinds of complicated factors here. Heck, I even wrote a whole book about how consumerism is impacting the way our culture thinks about faith. But we can't put all the blame on those who are leaving the church. Josh Packard is a sociologist who's researched this issue. He came to some really surprising conclusions. First, he found that a decline in church involvement was not matched by a decline in religious belief. He wrote this: people are as concerned as ever about religion and are finding religion in their daily lives. However, the trend across all age groups is to move away from church and religious institutions as the central organizing mechanism for this activity. But here's the part that might really surprise you. Packard discovered that the most spiritually mature people and those who were the most involved with church activities were also the most likely to leave the church. Based on interviews, he found that those who left the church, quote, didn't stop doing things to advance what they believed to be the work of God. They stopped doing things to advance the work of the church. Did you get that? It's totally counterintuitive. Most of us assume it's the least involved and the least mature who are most likely to drop out of the church. But it's not. It's people
Some of you maybe identify that
those
photo.
who are totally committed to Christ and who have a long history of deep involvement in the church. So what's going on? How do we explain this? Well, I want to propose that we overlook something really important. Rather than blaming all of this on youth sports or laziness or even Christian consumerism, we also need to look at cruise ships. Let me begin with some history. In the first half of the 20th century, ocean liners were how most people traveled between Europe and America. We often think of the glamorous first-class passengers enjoying these floating palaces. But in truth, ocean liners served a very practical function. They moved people and cargo from point A to point B. That's why they were called liners. But the glory days of the ocean liners began to fade in 1953 when a comet roared across the Atlantic. The de Havilland Comet was the first commercial jetliner. The fastest ocean liners took about 6 days to cross the Atlantic, but a jet could do it in just 6 hours. And overnight, the vast ocean became just the pond. Many thought passenger shipping would never recover, but they were wrong, because some innovative ship owners thought of a new way for their fleets to make money. Cruises. Rather than the practical purpose of moving people from one point to another, cruises were intended for fun, and they usually sailed in a circle, starting and ending in the same port. This fundamentally changed the purpose of the ship. Before, a ship was a form of transportation, but with cruises, the ship became the destination. That's why modern cruise ships dwarf the old ocean liners. They have to cram so many features on board to attract passengers. Today, megaships have parks, carousels, water slides, whatever these things are, ice skating, roller skating, bumper cars, simulated surfing, simulated skydiving, simulated families, even bowling lanes. I mean, seriously, who goes bowling on a cruise ship? All of this happened because ships went from being vehicles to being destinations. So what does all this have to do with the church? Well, like ocean liners, for centuries, churches had a simple purpose. They gathered people together and transported them into communion with God. That was it. But in the 1960s, changes in our culture started drawing young people away from the church. Baby boomers weren't that interested in connecting with God anymore, and small, simple churches just couldn't compete with the attraction of shopping malls and multiplexes and rock concerts. But some innovative pastors came along with a new idea. If people no longer felt the need to connect with God, then perhaps something else would draw them into the church. The need for community or entertainment or help with their families. In other words, rather than making the church a vehicle for connecting with God, they decided to make the church a destination in itself. They even invented a new word. We used to talk about Christians and non-Christians, or believers and non-believers, but starting in the 1970s, we began talking about the unchurched. And since then, the number of megachurches has exploded, while the actual number of people attending church has declined. In order to attract people, just like cruise ships, churches have had to get bigger and bigger with more and more features. We now think it's completely normal for churches to include coffee shops, bookstores, food courts, recreation centers, water parks, children's ministries packed with Xboxes and climbing walls, aquariums, and yes, there are even churches with bowling alleys. Seriously, who bowls in church? Now don't get me wrong, this has all been done with the very best of intentions. And in some cases, those intentions actually work. I'm sure there are people who entered a church because it has a great CrossFit program and actually found Jesus there. And that's great, but we need to remember that a huge church can survive if you don't find God there. But it can't survive if you don't fund its programs. And that brings us back to the real reason you may be uneasy about church. A lot of us aren't going to church for the climbing wall, or for the laser show, or the dancing fountains. We're going because we want to meet God. But over time, if we don't find Him there, we give up. We're looking for a simple ocean liner to take us into communion with God, but instead we find a sea of entertaining cruise ships that sometimes don't take us anywhere at all. The Barna organization has found that the number one reason millennials go to church is to be closer to God. But it's also the number one reason they leave the church. Maybe it's time for the church to just be the church again. Maybe it doesn't have to be a rec center or a shopping mall or even a bowling alley. Maybe people aren't giving up on the church because our culture has moved away from God. Maybe it's because the church has. If you'd like to read more, check out my ebook, How Churches Became Cruise Ships, a survival guide for the seasick Christian.
You know, more recent studies state the same thing you say. That news is about 8 years old. More recent studies state the two biggest reasons that young people go to church today. Number one, to become closer to God. Number two, to learn about God. The number one and two reasons young people go to church. However, I would agree with Sky in saying many of our churches became cruise ships. Many of our youth groups became cruise ships. Instead, what we actually should have been was ocean liners. You see, young people actually needed to go to church, to be in community, to seek God together, and to enter communion with Him. Instead, the church became a place of fun, entertainment, and many other things. And then maybe throw God a little bit in there, right? Number one and two reasons they want to go to church, we actually were not meeting. In addition, we also saw the uptick of consumer Christianity. And I have to wonder, and my research would say this as well, entertainment-driven youth ministry created a generation of consumers Christians. Because it was all about just feeding them more and more and more and more and more what I want. Right? Eugene Peterson says this. He says, "We expect brilliance from the pulpit, but we often accept mediocrity in our souls. What is presented up front is often exceptional, yet most of us live average lives." A consumerist church is an anti-Christ church. You see, what Peterson is pointing at is you can have dazzling preachers, you can have dazzling worship, you can have dazzling light shows, at youth groups you can have awesome games, in church you can have awesome games, you can have coffee shops, you can have bowling alleys apparently, you can have Xbox rooms. I've been in many churches with Xbox rooms, you can have playgrounds, it looks like a McDonald's in there, but what we're actually doing is we're missing the point, right? What we're trying to do is actually just create something more entertaining than the world. And guess what? We don't do a very good job at even that. You know, when I was in Montreal, I had a few youth pastors say, "You gotta do youth ministry on a Friday night." And I'm like, you know what? In my experience, when you don't do youth ministry on a Friday night, your attendance is way better. And even for like good reasons, like families go away to the cottage, visiting grandma and grandma. Like, there's many reasons why people can't come on a Friday night. Do it on a Wednesday night. Overall, I found that to be the best. But they said, "No, Derek, you gotta do youth ministry on a Friday night. You gotta pull the kids out of the clubs." I said to them, I'm like, if the kids want to go to the clubs, they're gonna go to the clubs. What we're doing here is not better than the club if that's what they're really after, right? Kids are gonna do what they want to do in that sense. If we're just trying to be a better attraction, that, most of the time doesn't even work. And even if it has temporary work, it doesn't have long term. I say this all the time too. I've seen kids ministries with big playgrounds, with big razzle-dazzle, kids just playing the whole time, having fun. I see youth groups where they play games for an hour and a half, and then they go to church and they sit through a 45-minute sermon, some announcements, and a few songs. And you wonder why they don't want to go to church. Because in youth group, they were there for the games. And when they go to church and they don't find the games, or they don't find the entertainment, what are they there for? You see, if we actually, when kids are young, make church, kids ministry, youth group, the place where we can come together as a community to experience God and have communion with Him, if they get that mission, if they get that calling, and they get that experience, they'll want to be in church as well, if they're finding that in church. Key is they have to find that in church. And this leads to what I would call, and what not just myself would call, the rise of spiritualism. The rise of spiritualism. I'm really excited because this is all brand new. Studies came out in December 2023. You guys are on the ground floor of this. Ground floor. December 2023, and the latest study came out in January, last month. Brand new studies. Fascinating. You guys are hearing this before anyone else in the church is hearing this. You guys are cutting edge. We've seen the rise of spiritualism. Who here has heard someone identify themselves as spiritual? Okay. Statistically, many of you will. And you see, we're going to look at a few statistics on spiritualism today, but I want to say again, I want to make sure we understand this connection. I truly believe one of the reasons we've seen the rise in spiritualism, and one of the reasons we've seen all the de-churching, is we've done it to ourselves. We've done it to ourselves. We created church to be the cruise ship instead of the ocean liner. People were not finding God in church. These are the new studies. 70% of people, this was done by the Pew Research Center, which is the biggest one of these studies, 70% of people now consider themselves to be spiritual in some way. Now, of course, Christians would also be identifying as spiritual. They belong to that different religion. However, 22%, 1 in 5 people, are considering themselves to be spiritual but not religious. That is fascinating to me. That is groundbreaking. You do this study 20 years ago, good luck getting 1 in 20. 1 in 5 people are identifying as spiritual but not religious. Now this is interesting. 50%, this is a concerning one, 50% of Americans believe that animals, graveyards, and parts of nature can have spirits or spiritual energies. Half the people are believing that. So as part of the spiritualism now we're also seeing the rise of New Age. I think Jeff I've said this on a Sunday morning, maybe he said this in other places for sure. What we're actually almost seeing a return to now is a return to the paganism. We're almost seeing a return to paganism that we see in the Bible.
Stone Age.
I tell the young people, if you actually want to learn how to live as a Christian in today's world, read the New Testament and read the early church fathers. Because it's becoming a very, very similar world in that sense. Half of people believe animals, graveyards, and parts of nature can have spirits or spiritual energies. 1 in 5 religious but not religious, but spiritual. 42% believe the dead can communicate with the living. 42%. When I was doing this research a couple days ago, I was literally in my office just like flabbergasted. 42%. Because I kind of knew this was a thing, but I actually have stats. When you're actually you're like, I've always thought that was the case, now I have statistics. That's kind of exciting in some ways, but also really sad. 74% say that there are some things that science cannot possibly explain. That's actually a good one. There's some hope in that. 30% say they've had personally encountered a spirit or an unseen spiritual force. This is the world in which our young people are living in. David Kinnaman, who's from the Barna, their Christian research group, he says this. He says, though religious affiliation and church attendance continues to decline, spiritual openness and curiosity are on the rise across every generation. In fact, we see an unprecedented desire to grow spiritually, a belief in spiritual supernatural dimension, and a belief in God or a higher power. There's a lot of concerning things about this, like when we're talking about people really getting into New Age, that very much concerns me, especially as a pastor of young people. However, there is some encouragement here, and this is where we're going to start seeing some hope, because I've given you a lot of bleak, but here's where we're going to take the turn. Some hope is coming. I tell young people all the time, you have a greater opportunity for evangelism, probably more than any generation previous. Because there is a spiritual openness among young people. Some of that spiritual openness has been developed out of a brokenness. We live in a broken world. Kids have now lived through a pandemic. They've seen the fragility of human life. They've seen the fragility of our culture. They've seen a fragility of our society. So some of that's out of a brokenness. And some of this is people wanting to have the purpose. People looking for that higher power. I talk to youth all the time, they say, I am having so many conversations with people who believe in a higher power, that they don't believe in the God I believe in. Right? There's also a big rise of what I would call just the negative perception. I see this a lot in our high schools, the negative perception of the church. Again, I truly believe we did that to ourselves partially. A lot of young people are done with the church. I ministered in Quebec, at a church in Quebec in the 1950s. Who here has heard of the name's escaping me right now? The Quiet Revolution, 1950s. Quiet Revolution, Quiet Revolution, the name was escaping me. Quiet Revolution. In the 1950s, Quiet Revolution was a great rejection toward the church, right? When I was in Quebec, the Catholic churches are empty. Some of that's probably for good. It's probably a good thing. some of the idolatry that happened there. They're empty. I mean, when we were in Quebec, only 2% identified as evangelical Christian. 2%. So 1 in 50 people. However, evangelicalism in Quebec hit rock bottom in the 80s because in the 1950s there's this large rejection of church, and all this church heard, this is the hope. And I say, maybe we're going to have some pain here. This is the hope. Displace a few generations. I found in Quebec so many people, and way more here, so many people actually knew nothing about the church. They knew nothing. And in a sense, they were actually more open to the church because they didn't have that church hurt. Because they were already a few generations displaced from the church. And I was starting to see that turn. And we're starting to see some really beautiful things happen in the province of Quebec. Jesus is moving in the province of Quebec. And it's incredible. The church is picking up steam in Quebec, the most it's had in 75 years. And it's beautiful things happening. And a lot of it has to do with where a few generations removed, and it's like preaching to an island of people who have never heard about Jesus before and never heard of the church. It's not those preconceptions they're entering. Here we're seeing a lot of people who have issues with the institutionalized church. I talk to you all the time about issues with the institutionalized church. But they're struggling because they need a purpose. So many of our youth are broken, and they're searching for a purpose. People, I have friends who are using crystals. And they're using crystals not just because they think they're shiny, it's because they're broken. And they're searching for higher power. And many of those friends who are using crystals, in fact, most of them, used to go to church. But they never found God here. They found the cruise ship. And now they're searching for that greater purpose in other ways. We've done a deep hurt in that sense. The challenge facing the church and parachurch ministries is whether they are ready and able to meet the spiritual open, where they are as they are. Our data shows the church has a real work to do to bridge the trust gap for people who are spiritual but not religious. I feel like right now, as a church, and I say this as WP, a Big C church, I feel like we're at a crossroads right now, and we have some options here. Because all this is super new. Like in the last 3 years, we've seen the spiritualism rise. Like this is like, it's going quick. And we have an opportunity. How are we going to respond? Are we going to just isolate ourselves and just call spiritualism evil? And there's a lot of evil in spiritualism, but are we just going to call it evil and just distance ourselves? Or are we actually going to become a place where we are willing to engage with these people and show them that you can actually find God at church? You can find that need for a higher power at church. I don't fully know what that looks like. Like I said, I found this study 3 days ago. I haven't fully processed what that looks like. But those are you're just hearing a bit of my heart what I'm processing too. I don't know how we're going to do this, but I know we have to do it if we want to reach the next generation. I was actually on a Q&A panel in our youth group a few weeks ago. And we were talking about like sharing Jesus with our friends, and on the panel was mostly millennials. And there was a few of them, and good intentions, great people, good intentions. A few of them basically said, yeah, my experience is, like just build relationships with people and live a good life and live differently, and people will notice, and then build that relationship. Maybe you can share Jesus down the road, right? There's this old saying, and it's attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, although he didn't actually say it. The saying is, preach the gospel and when necessary use words. That saying is I'm a farm boy, I could give a word for that saying, right? That saying's a load of crap. We bought into that lie that if we live good lives, that's enough, right? And there was a few millennials who were on that panel, they're just like, yeah, just like live good lives and maybe it'll come up. And I'm like, I think actually that's not accurate to what the opportunity is today. So I tried to be graceful that I think I was able to. I actually was like, no, we actually have a great opportunity here. And you have a great opportunity to use your words and have these conversations because people are more open than they've ever been. And I'm like, am I crazy in this? So I started talking to some of our youth, and I had a conversation with one yesterday. And they said, you know, Derek, I'm having conversations constantly about God. I'm having conversations constantly about a higher power. I'm having conversations constantly about how we're not here for nothing. One thing that's really encouraging too is we're actually seeing the fall of atheism. The amount of atheists is dropping in like dramatic numbers. So some of that's the rise of spiritualism and the drop in atheism. We're seeing even major atheists who have been proclaiming atheism for many years are actually saying, no, I'm actually not an atheist anymore. Because there's no purpose in atheism. What's the point? Like in a sense, there's no hope in atheism, right? And many are actually becoming Jesus followers, which is super encouraging. But then also there's a whole group that are just finding their purpose in the spiritualism. So what is the hope for tomorrow? And what role do you have to play? I believe in this passage, and I believe in its truth. Now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the powers of hell will not conquer it. Jesus is not done with the church. The church has a role to play. Yes, we've done many things which maybe have had negative consequences, but we've also done a lot of beautiful things too. You know, one of the main reasons that atheism is dying too is the question of morality, and atheists are actually realizing, and some of the key intellectual atheists and academic atheists are realizing pretty much all of our morality has roots in the Christian faith, in the Mosaic Law. Without the Mosaic Law, our concept of morality is almost non-existent, right? And you know, the church has a great opportunity to show people the way, to show people the way to Jesus, but we cannot be a cruise ship. We have to be an ocean liner, showing people the way to Jesus. And here is my calling for you, because you have a role to play. While the church has a role to play, the people in the church have a great role to play. Let's talk about children for a minute. Children and youth. Who is the greatest discipler in the child's life? A, the church. B, the parents. C, Christian music. Or D, Bible quizzing. Who thinks A?
Parents.
Who thinks B? That's good. Who thinks C? DC talk. Who thinks D? No, B's the answer. The parents are the number one discipler in a child's life. I always say to parents, you know, we have at most, if your kids attend no programs here, we have around 1 hour a week with your child. An intentional time with your child, we have around 45 minutes. And let's say they go to programs, that gives us a couple more hours. Think of how many hours you have with your child. I say this all the time too. One of our biggest things is that we wonder how people are being discipled. Derwin Gray is a pastor in the States. He's like, you know, I wonder what's the greatest discipler in a lot of our people's lives when they are being discipled by 40 hours a week of cable news and 1 hour a week of church. What's going to be the greater discipler in your life? 40 hours of cable news or 1 week of church? What's going to be the greatest discipler in your child's life? 1 hour of church and 40 hours of Jesus is nowhere to be found? Do we really expect church to make that big of a difference? Parents have the greatest opportunity, the greatest discipler in their child's life, hours and hours. I truly believe B, second, is grandparents. Grandparents have the greatest opportunity, plus adoptive grandparents. I have 2 adoptive grandparents, not actually adopted, but we adopted them when I was young. We called them Grandpa Everett and Grandma Irene. I've known them since they were 3 years old. Since I was 3 years old, not they were 3 years old. Since I was 3 years old, they were in my parents' small group. And I was raised with them. I had an extra set of grandparents. Now he's 91 and she's 88. They've been in my whole life, all my formidable years. Grandparents, adopted grandparents, friends, The church comes after that. This passage is one of the reasons and the way we disciple. You should imitate, this is Paul speaking, you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ. This is the idea of discipleship, right? Imitate Christ so that they will see Christ in you. I got 2 stories for you. Number 1 is a story of Rich. Rich is a pastor of New Life Fellowship in New York, in Queens, New York. Very multicultural church. I heard Rich preach and speak at a conference in October in Nashville. I've been tracking with Rich for quite a few years. His church was the church that birthed Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which we're running here in the fall. And I just did a session of that with our parents. Rich here calls this place his first monastery. His first monastery. 406 Alton Street in Brooklyn. That was the home of his grandparents. Now, Rich became a Christian when he was 19. He found Jesus when he was 19. And his grandfather discipled him for 2 to 3 hours per day, 4 to 5 days per week, at the edge of his bed for 7 months before he died. Rich came after work every day, and he sat with his grandfather for 2 to 3 hours per day, Monday to Friday, at the edge of his bed. And his grandfather discipled him for 7 months. He taught Rich on prayer, holiness, his love for Trinitarian theology, and what it meant to walk in the ways of Jesus. Rich would say this alone was the most transformational and impactful discipleship opportunity he ever had. His grandfather used the last 7 months of his life to pass on everything he knew about his life, Jesus, to his grandson. The next one is me. That's me with my grandfather. I lost my Opa when I was 11 years old. My Opa was a theology prof and register at a seminary in Briarcrest, Saskatchewan, where I went. He loved theology. He was not a Christian until he was around in his 30s. He became a Christian. He met Jesus. A few years later, he became a Christian in his early 30s. He was an accountant. He owned 3 accounting firms in the Netherlands. Then they immigrated to Canada, and his accounting license didn't transfer, so he opened up a bakery. He had never baked before. He opened up a bakery and donut shop. Now, that was in his early 30s. When he immigrated to Canada, he became a believer. By the time he was in his early 40s, he decided to pursue a call to ministry. He went out to Briarcrest College in Saskatchewan, or at that time Briarcrest Bible College, to do his degree. My Opa was a genius. I did not inherit his mind. I wish I did. He did his 4 years bachelor's degree in 2 years. He graduated with a 97% average, one of the top averages in the college's history. He would sit in the front row of every class, and he would sit there with my Uncle Richard, who also was going through for ministry. He was so good at academics, they basically told him, you know, if you have a call to pastoral ministry, pursue that, but maybe academia is also in your future, and teaching. And my Opa loved to teach. So he did his master's right away. During this time, they were also quite poor. They lost their bakery due to Tim Hortons opening up in Huntsville. So they were a coffee and donut shop and bakery, and Tim Hortons opened and then ran them out of business. And then they go to Bible college, so as you can imagine, they don't have a lot of money. My Opa would get up at 4 in the morning during his degree and go bake in the bakery in town, bakery and restaurant. He would bake until 10, and then he would go to class and work. And instead of doing the regular course load of 4 or 5 classes, he would do 7 or 8 a semester. And work his butt off, and then go home and do it all again the next day. And then he would do that same thing to his master's. They were running out of money, so he was doing a full-time master's and working almost full-time at the bakery there as well. After that, the college hired him right away. He had a dream of going to Oxford University in England, in a theology program. I actually had a similar dream, but they only accept 15 people per year in their theology program. He had a dream. He actually could have done it, but financially he couldn't do it. And the college offered him a job as a part-time prof and registrar at the seminary. My Opa saw me as a young boy. I think he knew I was going to become a pastor. He knew I was going to love theology, and I'd had conversations about God with him. When I was 11 years old, or 10 years old rather, he got prostate cancer. And he passed away. In a sense, my mom will always tell you she feels so robbed that my Opa wasn't fully able to disciple me as I entered ministry. She's like, Tarek, he would have been so proud of you. I decided to enter ministry, or felt called to ministry when I was around 17, and when I was around 18, I was taking a year off to work. And I was really falling in love with theology. In the church I was raised, I didn't really find theology. I didn't really know anything about it. In fact, I would actually say I didn't even know my Bible that well. Born and raised in the church, I really didn't know my Bible that well. At the dinner table, we read the daily bread, and at church, we looked at a few verses and moved on. I discovered his binders when I was 18. 4 binders of his class notes and his personal notes. And I read through those binders from front to cover. And I got to know my Opa from reading through those binders. And I got discipled by my Opa through reading through those binders. I found some interesting things too. I found out that he got letters from the president. He was a hardcore Arminian, really was against Calvinism. He got some letters from the president to tell him to cool it, because he was making the Calvinist kids in his class annoyed. He also was a firm believer in women in ministry, and he also got a letter from the president saying, cool it, you're making all the complementarians annoyed with you. He was a passionate man. But I got discipled through reading those notes and that legacy that he left. You never know how God can use you, but you gotta be open. And you know, I was discipled by my Opa after he passed. Rich was discipled by his grandfather on his deathbed. And my encouragement to you would be, don't wait until then. Now's the time. If you have grandkids, if you have kids in your life, if you have young people in your life, now's the time. And I truly believe we're in a time where kids need you more than ever before. The different messages they are getting from this world, messages of how to define their identity, the messages of spiritualism that we were looking at, kids need their grandpas, their grandmas, their adopted grandma and grandpas more than ever. We as a church need you more than ever. It always saddens me if I see a church where it seems like there's been bought into the lie that God's done with you at a certain age. When I was doing youth ministry as a kid, there was a youth leader who, his name was Mark. Mark was in his 60s, most popular youth leader there. When I was speaking at camp, there was a guy named Robin. Robin was in his early 80s, most popular camp counselor there. When I was doing youth ministry in Montreal, there was a guy named Yvonne. Yvonne was retired, most popular youth leader there. Those are my experiences. I have 3 experiences there, where the most popular youth leader was the oldest one there. Kids ministry too. You have the ability to disciple the next generation. Our kids need grandparent-like influences in their life. As Fred was sharing, you have so much to give us. When I was a kid, my parents entered a small group, and this was an interesting move on their part, but really fruitful move. Normally you'll see families enter a small group with other families, right? My parents entered a small group with other seniors. Everett and Irene became our adopted grandparents. Ross and Joyce, they're now in their 80s. They became another set of grandparents. Leonard and Pearl became another set of grandparents. Pearl recently asked me to do her funeral when she passes. She's not well right now, which was an honor. Art and Jenny, another set of grandparents. You know, normally, my grandfather, my dad's dad, is also passing away of cancer, so normally you would just like pass off kids to friends' houses. We were always dropped off at our adopted grandparents' houses. We spent time at Art and Jenny's house. I spent time at Ross and Joyce's house. Spent time at Everett and Irene's house. And people say, Derek, why are you so comfortable with seniors? I've done seniors ministry as well, visitation ministry. Why are you so comfortable with seniors? I point to that experience. I was raised with seniors. And the influence that they have had in my life is so great. I actually do not know if I would be in ministry if it wasn't for their influence. I truly would question that. There is great opportunity. Whether God has blessed you with grandkids or not, there is still a great opportunity to be adopted grandparents, to the next generation, to be youth leaders, to be kids ministry leaders. Your church body needs you. We need the gifts and unique life experience of all generations. We are better together. I truly believe that. And as we looked, you know, church is in an interesting place today. Kids are in an interesting place today. But there's a hope, and I believe each and every one of you can have and play a role in that hope. I've heard countless stories of kids who are following Jesus today because Grandma and Grandpa left it there. I cannot tell you how many kids I've had where their parents are not following Jesus, and Grandma and Grandpa are bringing them to church, bringing them to Wanda Kids Camp, bringing them to youth group, and discipling their kids and their grandkids. Can I pray for you? Can I pray for you? Lord, thank you for all that you've done and all that you are doing. Lord, we believe that you love your church. You will build your church. And we don't have to worry about tomorrow. We don't have to worry about the statistics because you are God. You are Lord. And we trust in you. Lord, I commission each and every person in this room today. By your Holy Spirit, I commission them to disciple and be disciplers of the next generations. I commission them to show their grandkids, their adopted grandparents, other young people in their lives, the ways of Jesus. Lord, what a testimony it is to serve Jesus for 90, 80, 70, 60, 50 years. The long haul. We have so much to learn, Jesus. And Lord, I commission them today to be empowered to go and make disciples in their families, in their communities, and the people that you bring into their lives. May we follow in your